The porcelain teacup didn't just fall, it was hurled, shattering against the mahogany floor of Waverley Hall. My sister, Beatrix, stood over me, her face a mask of aristocratic fury. "You are sterling, Arthur. Your blood is a debt owed to this crown, not a gift to be squandered on a common flower girl." Before I could pull my hand back, she snatched the small silver locket I had hidden in my palm, a gift from Alara, the gardener's daughter. With a cold, practiced cruelty, she tossed it into the roaring fireplace. I watched the metal glow orange and then black, the only piece of my heart turning to soot. The injustice was immediate, a sharp physical pain that went deeper than the bruises she often left on my soul during our lessons. Beatrix had spent my entire life refining me, turning me into a cold, hollow vessel of the Marquess of Thorn, all to secure a political alliance with the Duke of Somerset. Every time I showed a spark of humanity, she extinguished it. "If you ever look at her again," she whispered, her voice like ice cutting through silk, "I will ensure Alara is sent to the workhouse in the northern fens. She will die in the cold, and it will be your hand that pushed her." I felt a sickening hurt, a deep betrayal of the blood that was supposed to protect me but only sought to enslave me. I realized then she didn't want a brother, she wanted a puppet. I escaped the suffocating air of the drawing room and headed straight for the glass hoses, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine usually calmed me, but today, every shadow felt like Beatrix's watchful eye. I found Alara near the ferns, her hands stained with soil and her eyes bright with a life I was forbidden to share. I tried to tell her to stay away, to save herself from my sister's malice, but she didn't look afraid. Instead, she reached out and touched my cheek, her skin warm against my cold face. "A man who hides his heart to keep a title is a man who is already dead, Arthur," she said quietly. Her bravery made my own fear feel shameful. I wanted to pull her into my arms and run away from Waverley Hall, but I knew the reach of the Sterling name was long and cool. As I looked at her, I saw a thistle among roses, wild, strong, and unwilling to be crushed. She wasn't just a gardener's daughter, she was the only person who saw the boy beneath the Marquess. But even as we stood there, I felt the weight of the world pressing down on us. I had to protect her, but I didn't yet know how to fight a ghost like Beatrix. As Alara reached up to tuck a stray lock of hair behind my ear, her fingers paused at the edge of my high collar. She pulled the silk back just an inch, revealing the faint red marks, the corrections Beatrix had given me with her silver-tipped crop when I failed to recite the lineage of the Somerset family. Alara didn't gasp or cry. She simply looked at the marks with a fierce, burning knowledge. "She uses pain because she is terrified of the truth," Alara whispered. She leaned closer, her voice barely a breath. "Do you truly believe your father died of a sudden fever, Arthur?" "My father saw the physician leaving the manor with a heavy bag of gold the night the Marquess passed. He saw the bottles that were never recorded in the ledger." My blood turned to ice. The story I had been told for 5 years, that my father's heart had simply given out, began to crumble. If my father had been murdered, then my sister wasn't just a tyrant, she was a criminal. Alara knew more than she should, and that knowledge made her the most dangerous person in Beatrix's world. I realized then that my sister didn't just despise Alara for her status, she despised her because Alara held the key to our family's darkest secret. The following morning, the manor was draped in the colors of the Kent family. Beatrix sat at the head of the breakfast table, a smug smile playing on her lips. Without even looking up from her tea, she dropped the hammer. "I have finalized the arrangements, Arthur. You are to be betrothed to Lady Penelope of Kent. The announcement will be made at the autumn ball." I stood up so quickly my chair screeched against the stone. "I will not marry a woman I do not know to satisfy your greed," I said, my voice shaking with the control I was fighting to maintain. Beatrix slowly set down her spoon and pulled a document from her lace sleeve. "Then perhaps you would prefer the magistrate to see this. It is a confession from Alara's father, admitting he stole the family silver to pay for his drink. It carries the penalty of the gallows." I knew it was a forgery the moment I saw the shaky signature. Alara's father was a man of honor who had never touched a drop of gin in his life. But in this county, Beatrix's word was law, and a servant's word was nothing. She was using the lives of the people I loved to buy my silence and my soul. I sank back into my seat, the high stakes of her game finally clear. I had to play the part of the obedient brother while I searched for the truth. I waited until the moon was high and the guards were changing shifts before I met Alara in the restricted archives of the manor's library. The room smelled of old paper and ancient dust, a place Beatrix rarely visited because she hated the past. Together, we searched the private journals of my late father, looking for any clue of his final days. Behind a row of books on heraldry, Ilara's sharp eyes found a loose floorboard. Tucked beneath it was a single, crumpled letter addressed to me, but never sent. My father's handwriting was frantic, the ink smeared as if his hand had been shaking. "Arthur, my boy, do not trust the tea. Beatrix has grown impatient for the title. If I do not survive the night, look to the physician's notes. I beg for mercy that this house has forgotten." Reading those words felt like being punched in the chest. My father had known his own daughter was killing him, and he had spent his final moments trying to warn me. The mercy he spoke of wasn't just for him. It was a plea to save the sterling name from the darkness Beatrix had brought into it. We had the evidence of her intent, but we needed the physician's records to prove the poison. Ilara gripped my hand, her presence the only thing keeping me from screaming in the hollow silence of the library. The dinner with Lady Penelope was a nightmare of forced smiles and clinking silver. Penelope was a cold woman, her eyes constantly darting to Beatrix for approval, as if she too were a bird in a cage. When the Duke of Somerset rose to propose a toast to our inevitable union, I felt the drum of rebellion in my chest reach a fever pitch. I stood up, my glass empty. "I cannot toast to a lie," I said, my voice carrying across the silent hall. "There will be no marriage, for my heart is already promised elsewhere." The shock in the room was a physical thing. Beatrix's poise didn't just slip, it shattered. She stood up, her face turning a sickly shade of red, and for the first time, she didn't care who saw her rage. She leaned across the table and hissed, "You will sign that contract tonight, or I will set fire to the gardener's cottage with everyone inside it. I will burn this village to the ground before I let you ruin our standing." The guests gasped, realizing the perfect Lady Beatrix was a woman on the edge of madness. I looked at Penelope and saw a flicker of horror in her eyes. I realized then that Beatrix was losing control, and a cornered predator is the most dangerous kind. While the manor was in an uproar over my defiance, Ilara had slipped into the potting shed to hide from Beatrix's men. There, tucked inside a hollowed-out bag of peat, she found something far more valuable than silver. It was a secret ledger, bound in black leather, containing a list of every tenant on the Waverley estate. As I joined her in the shadows, we scanned the columns of numbers. Beatrix had been systematically stealing the pension funds of the elderly tenants, the very people who had worked the land for 40 years. She wasn't just a murderer, she was a thief who was using the blood of the poor to pay off her own massive gambling debts in London. The ledger showed that Waverley Hall was essentially bankrupt, held together only by the lies Beatrix told the bank and the Duke. "She needs this marriage to cover the theft," Ilara whispered, her eyes wide with the realization. "If you don't marry Penelope, the Duke won't release the funds, and Beatrix goes to prison." This was the twist we needed. She wasn't fighting for the sterling name, she was fighting to stay out of a cell. Every move she made against us was fueled by the terror of being found out. Beatrix, realizing I wouldn't be broken by threats alone, decided to use public humiliation. She sent word to the kitchens that a new server was required for the engagement gala. When Ilara was summoned, she wasn't given a maid's uniform. Beatrix handed her a dress made of rough brown sacking, the kind used to hold grain. "Since you wish to be close to my brother," Beatrix sneered, "you shall serve him wine in front of the entire county. Let them see the beauty he prefers over a lady." It was a cruel, calculated move designed to strip Ilara of her dignity and make me ashamed of my choice. I watched Ilara take the coarse fabric, her head held high even as her fingers trembled. The stakes were no longer just about the ledger or the poison, they were about the very soul of the woman I loved. Beatrix thought she could make Ilara small, but she forgot that I had been watching her precision for 20 years. I knew how to turn a mockery into a masterpiece. I went to my mother's old rooms and broke the lock on a trunk of silks, my mind spinning with a plan to defy the mask my sister had built for me. All through the night, while the manor slept, I sat by a single candle with a silver needle and a spool of silk thread. Beatrix had forced me to learn the precision of a gentleman, the way a seam should sit, the way fabric should drape, so that I would always look perfect. Now, I used those hated lessons to save Ilara. I took my mother's finest emerald silk and the delicate lace she had worn on her own wedding day. My fingers ached and my eyes burned, but I didn't stop. I tailored a gown that was a defiance in every stitch. It wasn't a maid's uniform, it was the dress of a queen. I worked with a quiet, steady force, remembering the way Ilara looked in the sunlight of a glasshouse. By dawn, The sacking dress Beatrix had provided was in the trash, and in its place sat a gown of such beauty it seemed to glow in the morning light. I smuggled it to Ilara just as the first carriage arrived for the ball. "Wear this," I told her. "Do not serve. Walk among them as if you owned the stars." My sister's lessons in control had finally become my greatest weapon. The ballroom of Waverley Hall was a vision of gold and crystal, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies. Beatrix stood at the top of the stairs with Lady Penelope, both waiting for me to take my place. The music began, a slow, stately waltz. Suddenly, the double doors at the far end of the hall swung open. A woman stepped into the light, and a collective gasp rippled through the room. It was Ilara, dressed in the shimmering emerald silk I had sewn for her, the silver locket she thought she had lost, now cleaned of soot, hanging at her throat. She didn't have a tray of wine, she had the poise of a goddess. I ignored the Duke, I ignored the Marquess title, and I walked straight through the crowd to her. I took her hand and bowed so low my forehead nearly touched the floor. "Everyone expected me to marry well," I said, my voice echoing in the sudden silence. "But no one expected me to choose the true mistress of Waverley's heart." I led her into the center of the floor, and for the first time in my life, I danced with joy. Beatrix's face turned a ghostly white, her hand gripping the banister so hard her knuckles turned blue. The rebellion had begun in the most public way possible. In the chaos that followed our dance, Lady Penelope caught me in the hallway near the conservatory. I expected her to be furious, but instead, she looked over her shoulder with wide, terrified eyes. "You have to get her out of here, Arthur," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Beatrix isn't just angry, she's desperate. She told my father that if the engagement isn't signed tonight, she will release the letters my brother wrote before he took his own life. She's blackmailing my entire family to save herself from the ledger." Penelope reached into a bodice and pulled out a small, heavy brass key. "This opens the private safe in her dressing room. The physician's original notes are in there, along with the proof of the pension theft. She keeps them as insurance against her own accomplices." This was Penelope's pact, a secret alliance born from the same abuse I had suffered. She didn't want the title, she wanted her family's dignity back. I took the key, feeling its cold weight in my palm. We had a chance to end this, but we had to move before Beatrix realized her perfect bride had turned against her. Ilara and I raced toward Beatrix's dressing room, the key fitting perfectly into the hidden safe behind the portrait of our mother. We pulled out the physician's notes, which clearly listed arsenic trioxide as the cause of my father's fever. But as we turned to leave, the smell of smoke hit us. Beatrix stood in the doorway, a flickering torch in her hand and a wild look in her eyes. "If I cannot have the sterling legacy, no one will," she screamed. She threw the torch onto the heavy velvet curtains, and the dry fabric erupted into a wall of flame. The library was right next door, filled with the history of our bloodline. As the fire spread, the ledger fell from Ilara's hand into the growing heat. Ilara didn't run for the exit. She dove into the smoke, her hands clawing at the floor to save the silver locket that had fallen in the scramble. I pulled her back just as a beam groaned above us. "The locket doesn't matter, Ilara. You do," I shouted. We tumbled out of the room just as the ceiling collapsed, the evidence of the poison tucked firmly against my chest. But the fire was out of control, and Beatrix was already shouting for the guards to arrest us for arson. Beatrix used the fire as a final excuse to crush me. By the time the sun rose over the smoking ruins of the library, she had summoned a corrupt magistrate. "My brother has lost his mind to the gardener's daughter," she told the gathered crowd of horrified nobles. "He set fire to our ancestral home in a fit of madness." Before I could produce the physician's notes, the guards tackled me. Beatrix had me declared incapable of managing his own affairs due to mental instability. I was dragged away, not to a cell, but to the North Tower, the coldest, most isolated part of the manor. As they locked the iron door, I saw Ilara being loaded into a black carriage marked for the Northern Workhouse. "I will find you," I screamed through the narrow slit in the door. Beatrix stood in the courtyard, watching me with a cold, triumphant sneer. "She will be dead before the month is out, Arthur. And you will spend the rest of your life staring at these stone walls, wondering why you didn't just sign the paper." The transition was brutal. I went from a Marquess to a prisoner in a single morning. The North Tower was a place of damp stone and endless silence, but I was not as alone as Beatrix thought. On the 7th day, a small grey pigeon landed on my windowsill. Attached to its leg was a tiny scrap of parchment, written in a hand I knew better than my own. Ilara was alive. She had used her knowledge of the estate's carrier pigeons, birds she had helped raise since she was a child, to send me a coded message. The workhouse is a cage, but the birds are free. I have found the physician's assistant. He is hiding in the fens. He confirms the arsenic. Hold on, Arthur. The village is waking up. I realized then that while I was locked in a tower, Ilara was building a network. She was the one who truly understood the power of the lowly people. I sent a message back, telling her about the secret ledger I had memorized. We began to plot our revolution through the air, the pigeons carrying the truth that Beatrix thought she had burned. The stakes were no longer just about us, they were about the entire village finding the courage to rise. The iron bolt of my door slid back, and a man I hadn't seen in years entered. It was Dr. Stirlingvane, the man who had stood by my father's bed as he died. He looked older, his eyes twitching with a nervous energy. "The Lady Beatrix says you are agitated, Marquess," he said, his voice a oily whisper. He began to prepare a glass of water, adding several drops of a dark, thick liquid. "This laudanum will help you sleep. It will make the walls feel less like a prison." I looked at the glass and then at the doctor's shaking hands. He was the one who had provided the arsenic, and now he was here to finish the job by turning me into a mindless addict. I didn't take the glass. Instead, I stood up and walked toward him, using the very sterling authority Beatrix had taught me to command. "How much did she pay you to kill my father, Doctor? And how much is my life worth to you now?" He recoiled, the glass shattering on the floor. I saw the fear in his eyes. He knew that if Beatrix fell, he would go to the gallows with her. I had him cornered, but I needed a way out of the tower. Just as I was about to force the doctor to unlock the door, a massive roar echoed from the gates below. I looked out the window and saw a sight that made my heart leap. A group of village blacksmiths, led by Ilara, were battering at the main gates with heavy hammers. They weren't just servants anymore, they were a mob seeking justice for their stolen pensions. Ilara had escaped the workhouse and rallied the people. In the confusion, I turned back to the doctor. "The people are at the gates, Vane. If they find you here with that bottle, they will tear you apart. Show me the passage my father told me about, and I might save your life." Terrified, he pushed aside a heavy tapestry, revealing a narrow stone door. I stepped into the darkness, the sounds of the rebellion growing louder behind me. I wasn't just escaping. I was heading for the one place Beatrix never thought I'd go, the family crypt. The crypt was cold and smelled of wet stone and old roses. Ilara met me there, having slipped through the gardener's gate. We moved past the statues of our ancestors until we reached the newest tomb, the one belonging to my older brother, Thomas, who was said to have died of a broken heart after our mother passed. But as Ilara leaned against the heavy marble lid, it shifted. With our combined strength, we pushed the lid aside. The coffin was empty. There were no bones, no shroud, just a single, heavy wool blanket and a note from a private asylum in the north. Thomas wasn't dead. Beatrix had kidnapped the true heir and hidden him away so she could rule through me. She had stolen his life, my father's life, and was now trying to steal mine. The revelation was a roller coaster of shock. My brother was alive, and he was the key to taking everything back from the woman who had ruined us all. We knew we had to find proof of Thomas's existence before Beatrix could move him or kill him. We broke into the manor's study while the mob kept the guards busy at the front. In the bottom drawer of Beatrix's desk, hidden in a velvet-lined box, we found Thomas's signet ring. It was still stained with a bit of dried blood, as if it had been pulled from his finger by force. Beside it were the receipts from the Blackwood Asylum, showing that Beatrix had been paying a monthly fee to keep a John Doe in a padded cell. She had been drawing his entire inheritance for 5 years, using it to fund her life in London while he rotted in the dark. I gripped the ring, my heart burning with a protective fury. Beatrix hadn't just been a cool sister. She was a monster who had cannibalized her own family for the sake of a title that was never hers to hold. We were halfway to the stables when Beatrix stepped out of the shadows of the courtyard, the rain drenching her expensive silk gown. She was holding a pistol, and this time there was no crowd to stop her. "You should have stayed in the tower, Arthur," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and madness. She leveled the gun at Ilara's heart. "I will kill her, and then I will tell the world you did it before taking your own life." I didn't move. I used the blood-borne authority she had spent 10 years beating into me. I stood tall, my voice calm and steady. "The guards aren't coming, Beatrix. They've seen the ledger. They know about the pensions. They know about Thomas. I stepped in front of Alara, looking my sister in the eye. Shoot me, and you confirm every word they've said. Drop the gun, and I might let you live. For the first time, the perfect Lady Beatrix looked small. The power she thought she had was a ghost, and the brother she had created was now the one who held the leash. Before Beatrix could pull the trigger, a carriage with the royal crest pulled into the drive. The Duke of Somerset stepped out, his expression one of deep disgust. He looked at the smoking ruins of the library, and then at Beatrix holding a pistol in the rain. I came to finalize a marriage, Lady Beatrix, but I find I have stumbled into a den of thieves, he said. Beatrix dropped her hand, trying to smooth her hair and regain her poise. Your Grace, it is not what it seems. My brother is unwell. The Duke held up a hand, silencing her. I have already met with the village elders. I have seen the records of the stolen pensions. You didn't want an alliance, Beatrix. You wanted me to pay for your crimes. He turned to me, his eyes searching my face. He saw the marks on my neck, the soot on my clothes, and the woman standing firmly at my side. The high stakes of the game were finally coming to an end. The Duke walked over to Alara, looking at her with a profound respect. I have known many ladies in my life, he said quietly, but few with the courage to lead a village against a tyrant. He turned back to Beatrix, his voice cold as the North Sea. I am a man of the crown, Beatrix, and I will not be a part of your filth. I am withdrawing my support, my funds, and my name from this house. You are on your own. Beatrix collapsed onto the wet gravel, her world finally crumbling. Without the Duke's money, the banks would seize Waverley Hall within the hour. She had gambled everything on a marriage that was now a pile of ash. The Duke looked at me and nodded once. A man who chooses his heart over his blood is a man I can respect, Arthur. But you have much work to do to clean this house. The banks were already sending men to inventory the manor, but Beatrix had one last play. She tried to sell off the family's ancient heirlooms, the paintings, the silver, the very land itself, to a group of shady merchants so she could flee to the continent. But at the silent auction held in the village square, a man none of us recognized began to outbid everyone. He was a rich merchant from the colonies, a man with sun-darkened skin and eyes that looked like Alara's. He bought every piece of Waverley Hall, from the smallest spoon to the largest field. When the final gavel fell, he walked over to Alara and kissed her hand. I left this land a pauper, niece, but I have returned with the gold to make sure you never have to scrub a floor again. Ilara's secret uncle had been the one watching from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reclaim his family's dignity. Beatrix had nothing left to sell, and no way to escape. I didn't turn Beatrix over to the king's magistrate immediately. Instead, I brought her to the village tribunal, a gathering of the very families she had robbed. We sat in the small, drafty town hall, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and honest sweat. I didn't use the high-handed law of the nobility. I let the old women whose pensions had been stolen and the farmers whose land had been threatened speak their truth. Beatrix sat in a hard wooden chair, stripped of her jewelry and her pride, forced to listen to the human cost of her refinement. She tried to look down on them, but she had no height left to stand on. The village elders reached their verdict. She was to be stripped of her name and her right to ever step foot on Waverley land again. The satisfaction was quiet but firm. We were dismantling her piece by piece. In a final, desperate act of madness, Beatrix managed to slip away from the village guards. She lured Alara to the white cliffs of Dover, sending a fake message that I was injured and waiting there. When I arrived on horseback, the wind was howling off the English Channel. Beatrix was holding Alara near the crumbling chalk edge, her eyes wide and glassy. You think you can just walk away from the sterling name, Arthur, she screamed over the gale. It's in your bones. It's in the way you stand. Choose now. You can be the Marquess of Thorn and watch her fall, or you can be a nobody and lose everything. She was trying to force me back into the impossible choice she had been giving me since I was a child. The stakes were at their absolute peak, life or legacy. I looked at the ancestral seal of the Sterling family in my hand, the heavy gold ring that represented centuries of power and cruelty. Without a word, I hurled it into the ocean. I watched it vanish into the white foam of the waves. I am no longer a Sterling if it means being a monster like you, Beatrix. I shouted. The name died in the library fire. I am just a man who loves a woman, and that is more power than you have ever known. The shock of my renunciation broke her. She realized that the only thing she had to hold over me, the title, no longer had any value. Her hand shook, and her grip on Alara's arm loosened as she looked down into the abyss where the ring had gone. As the realization of her total defeat hit her, Beatrix's foot slipped on the wet grass near the cliff's edge. She let out a piercing scream as she began to fall backward into the void. I didn't think about the tea, the bruises, or the poison. I lunged forward, my hand closing around her wrist with the strength of a man who had finally found his own power. I held her there, suspended over the crashing waves, her life literally in my hands. I had total control. I could have let her go and ended the nightmare forever. But I looked at Alara, and I saw the woman I wanted to be worthy of. I pulled Beatrix back, dragging her onto the solid earth. I refused to let her become a martyr, and I refused to let her darkness turn me into a killer. I had saved her, not out of love, but out of a mercy she never showed me. Just as we reached the safety of the path, a royal messenger arrived with a troop of cavalry. They had come from the north. Thomas had been found. The John Doe in the Blackwood Asylum had been identified by the Duke of Somerset himself. My brother was alive, recovering in a hospital, his mind scarred but his spirit intact. The king had issued an official decree recognizing Beatrix's crimes of kidnapping, forgery, and attempted murder. Her status as a lady was officially revoked by the state. She was no longer a sister, a guardian, or sterling. She was a prisoner of the crown. The roller coaster of reveals had finally reached its end. Justice was no longer a village dream, but a royal reality. Beatrix was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in a secluded convent in the harshest part of the country, stripped of all wealth and influence. She was given a small cell with a single window that looked out over a barren field. I visited her one last time before the gates were locked. She sat in a plain gray habit, her hands finally still, staring at the stone walls. She didn't have her mirrors or her silk. She was left with nothing but the memories of the brother she had tried to break and the father she had killed. I didn't say a word. I simply left a single, fresh thistle on her table, a reminder of the girl she thought was a weed, but who had turned out to be the strongest thing in the garden. A month later, the bells of the parish church rang out across the valley. Arthur and Alara were married in a ceremony that cost nothing but meant everything. I had renounced the Marquess title, handing it back to my brother Thomas as he slowly returned to health. I became the estate manager for Waverley, working the land I had once only looked at from a window. We lived in a house filled with sunlight and the smell of roses. The people of the village no longer bowed in fear, they waved in friendship. I had finally lived up to my father's plea for mercy, not by ruling, but by saving. I was a man of the people, and for the first time, I knew who I was. I visited Beatrix one final time on a cold winter afternoon. She looked at me through the iron grate and asked, her voice a hollow rasp, was it worth it, Arthur, to throw away a kingdom for a commoner? I looked at Alara waiting for me at the gate, her hand resting on her stomach where our first child was growing. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes. I didn't lose my blood, Beatrix, I said, my voice steady and warm. I finally found it. You taught me how to control a world, but she taught me how to live in one. I turned and walked away into the snow, a man who had finally defied his blood for a love he could no longer deny. The victory was complete, and the heart had finally won.